you are, around the IMF's recent publication on social spending for inclusive growth in the Middle East and Central Asia. I'm particularly delighted to welcome this morning three fantastic speakers. The first is His Excellency Mr. Sahil Babayev, who is the Minister of Labor and Social Protection of the Republic of Azerbaijan. Ms. Rola Dashti, who is the Executive Secretary of the UN's Economic and Social Commission for Western Asia, based in Beirut, commonly known as ESCO, the UN's regional think tank. And Ms. Antoinette Sayeh, who is the Deputy Managing Director at the IMF. My name is Maha Yahya. I'm the Director of the Carnegie Middle East Center in Beirut, and I will be moderating this discussion. Basically, in short, the IMF just put out a report that looks at the strategies for social spending, ways that we can improve social spending in the Middle East and Central Asia to get, as they put it on the report, a better bang for your dollar or for your money. What we've seen over the past few months is that the impact of the pandemic has already aggravated pre-existing structural inequalities, whether in terms of income or in terms of access. It's exacerbated pre-existing poverty levels and actually driven an increase in some of them. It has hit some sectors of the population more than others, particularly informal labor and women. And this is not just about, the impact of COVID-19 is not just about the question of income, but also of access to services, whether it's health, whether it's education, whether it's unemployment benefits. Just very simply, it basically highlighted the division and the huge gap, or the gap, varying depending on where you are in the region, between those that have and those that don't have, those that have access and those that don't have, the haves and have-nots. And with the second wave of the pandemic beginning to hit some parts of the Middle East and Central Asia, a second lockdown has become much more difficult, and yet the need for social services has become far more necessary, despite a shrinking fiscal space across the globe, not just in these two regions. I'm going to begin today with a very general question to all the panelists. This will be followed by a second round of questions for each of the speakers. And then I will open it up to questions from the audience for any of the panelists. The questions can be sent by email. You can see all the details on the announcement for the webinar. So let me begin first with the first question, which is to each of the panelists. What did COVID-19 teach you about the importance of health? What lessons can we get out of the way COVID-19 has impacted our societies, particularly when it comes to issues related to health, to education, to social spending, social protection spending? And what are the challenges that each of your regions, from your perspective, for improving not only social indicators such as life expectancy, etc., but also for mobilizing resources for adequate social spending in a post-COVID world where fiscal space has really shrunk considerably, both globally and at the regional and national level? I'm going to begin this morning with Antoinette, who is as I said, the Deputy Managing Director at the IMF. The floor is yours, Antoinette.
Thank you very much, Maha, and a very good afternoon to all of you watching this program from the region, and of course, good morning to those here in Washington with me. Very pleased to join you today to discuss these issues. Using as a base this report that we've just finalized. And I think it's good to step back and approach your question from a longer term perspective of understanding where the region has come from. You've laid that out quite well, Maha, already, but just to underscore that generating inclusive growth has been a key challenge for the Middle East and Central Asian countries for a very long time, even before the pandemic. And of course, the region has experienced very high and rising inequality, both income and gender inequality, high youth employment, of course, internal conflicts in some countries, large movements of refugees, all of that making it even more challenging. And the paper we're putting out today shows that the region indeed made considerable progress in recent decades in improving social indicators. But unfortunately, in recent years, we've seen a deceleration of that progress, and in particular, with low-income countries in the region achieving less progress than they had previously. Uh, and of course, the region, when you look across and compare the region to its peers around the world, some deficiencies there. Maybe two examples that can illustrate the point I'm trying to make. On infant mortality, for example, the GCC countries in the region have levels of infant mortality twice the amount we see in advanced economies globally. Second example, looking at adult literacy, we see that emerging market countries in the Middle East and North Africa are actually almost 20% points lower than emerging market average across the world. So that's, of course, a significant concern. And we also see less, of course, spending, social spending, in countries that the region also spends less on public health, public education, social protection than its peers. Some average of a little more than 10% compared to more than 14% for emerging market economies worldwide. And that gap, again, is even larger for low-income countries in the region. Social spending has averaged just 8% of GDP annually, and that's compared to about 14% on average for peers, low-income peer countries globally. So, of course, as you've also indicated, Maha, the pandemic has really just magnified those challenges. Really exacerbating what was already there, weaknesses in health infrastructure, social safety nets, all of that very difficult. And we know, of course, that the crisis is still unfolding. We're not done yet, but we also already see signs that it's going to disproportionately impact the most vulnerable groups. And as you said, women, of course, youth, refugees, really threatening the achievements made by the region in recent decades. And we've already indications that about 10 million people have been already pushed into poverty, some 3 million of those people into absolute extreme poverty. So the crisis, of course, disproportionately affecting women in particular, who are in the most severely hit service sectors, the informal economy sectors. Women, of course, as we all know, shoulder a greater burden for childcare, elder care, and of course are on the front lines of trying to fight the pandemic in terms of their role in the health sector around the world. So very difficult there as well. So the crisis actually just illustrates the importance of having spent on the social sectors. Social spending is a key lever for supporting and promoting inclusive growth. The research in the paper documents that, showing that increased spending on education, health and protection, social protection leads to better education and health outcomes, reduce poverty and inequality, and of course can underpin robust long-term growth. So very important research there documenting that even if we saw just a 10% increase per capita in social spending that is maintained over maybe 3 years or so, you really can close between 20 and 40% of the gap in the Human Development Index. that there is in the Middle East and North African countries compared to the comparators. So quite a bit to say about the impact of social spending. And of course, we see in the crisis that those countries that had better resource social sectors have done well in protecting lives and livelihoods during the crisis. So just a key lesson of needing to maintain the focus on social spending, even when the pandemic is behind us, to be able to make that progress that the region needs to make towards the Sustainable Development Goals. Let me stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Antoinette. That's actually a wonderful trend opening to kind of set the scene about the importance of social spending for an inclusive growth, and how little, I mean, it's a small increase can have a much bigger impact than otherwise anticipated. And this kind of quantification, I think, really speaks for itself. Rola, let me move to you with the same question, maybe a bit more on the region in particular, especially because I know that ESCWA recently put out a policy brief looking at specifically COVID-19 and its impact on the region, but also it has a lot of work on the issue of social spending in the region. You're muted, Rola. You need to unmute yourself.
Sorry.
Yeah.
Sorry. Just to pick up where Antoinette has left and zooming in into our region, the first issue that we learned from COVID, and there are maybe an important issues, is that issue of solidarity. And the solidarity by all stakeholders within society. And this is an important issue that we need to capitalize on when we want to look and to recover better, so that we can get an inclusive growth. The second point that also COVID has showed us is that our social protection systems and policies has to be revisited also to become more comprehensive and more inclusive. As it stands, it's not inclusive and not comprehensive. So when we're looking into inclusive growth, so we need to revisit our social protection systems. The third thing is the issue of accessibility also is extremely important, and bridging the gap of the inequality that Antoinette has just mentioned, issues of income inequality gap and the gender inequality gap that is so big in our region. The region is one of the worst, among the worst regions globally of income inequality, where the 10% owns around 76% of the wealth of the region, and only 2% of the wealth is owned by the bottom 50% of the adult population. So it is extremely unequal region. So from this, COVID-19 told us also when we want to invest, we need to invest in survival of the people and survival of the business. And we need to balance between these two survivals. And governments in our region, because of the tight fiscal space, some of them opted, as the paper said, is that some of them opted to reallocate resources of the existing resources. But still, it's not enough because the fiscal space is already limited. Others increased with the stimulus, but it's ending up getting to borrow. And this makes it a bigger burden further to mitigate impact of COVID by borrowing. So we're putting a bigger also burden on the society and the economy. And we don't know yet is that countries that have reallocated their spending, fiscal spending, to mitigate COVID, how it will be the impact on the economy in general by the reallocation. Is it, would it have increased it, improved it? Aside from we know that the economies are going into recessions nowadays, but the reallocation, because the IMF paper is talking about reallocating the resources of the fiscal resources. And now we have a good example of reallocating the fiscal resources to mitigate COVID. And it's targeting also to one of the elements of the social element and the social spending is the health sector, where we're reallocating resources. would it become more inclusive into this? And this is we'll need to see and revisit with the numbers. But it's also important is the issue is that our data, and the paper has mentioned in the data and the deficiency in the data, and it's very important. The IMF now collects the central budgetary data on when we're talking about the government financial statistics. And I think it's very important now is that we need to look into the geographic distribution, because this will give us much more into the issue of accessibility, much more issue of inclusiveness in the social protection, and much more issues of efficiency in the spending. And then I need to add is that we need not only to look into the efficiency of the spending, is also the effectiveness of the spending is extremely as well as important as the efficiency of the spending. And this is maybe we need to look into broadening the perspective. And an additional issue is that the paper very nicely went and looked into the social protection, and it highlighted it's in the narrow thinking of the social definition of the social spending, I mean, and it had the three elements: health, education, and the social protection. But I think we need to look into it in a broader perspective. There is the other elements. Housing is a very important issue because we're talking about social equality, and housing becomes a very important issue. The issues of the labor market and job creation is another issue dimension. Issue of environment is a third dimension. We at ESQA are starting looking into the social expenditure monitor, and we're having 7 dimensions instead of 3 dimensions on the social policies, and looking into it so that we look into it. Yes, the paper highlighted adding these elements might not disrupt the finding. Yes, we're still talking about efficiency is extremely important in social policies. I think we need to add effectiveness, but also size is important, but also sometimes size can give you the wrong signaling, because you can expand in size by subsidies, but then at the end of the day, the poor is not going to be benefiting because of subsidies in fuel or whatever it is. So size is important, but what is the type of size we're talking about, and where is the size in that element is extremely important. Building on solidarity, I think there is now a window of opening, is that I look at the society in general. When looking into inclusive growth, and we're looking, it's not only governments, we're looking to other stakeholders. And I think now COVID is giving us an opportunity to look into how we can create a solidarity among various stakeholders within society to address also social policy issues and bridge the inequality gap. And here I'll come up, and that's what we're trying to advocate at ESQA, is the national solidarity funds. Creating a national solidarity funds, which is from the premise of shared responsibility, societal solidarity. And that fund is supposedly to link the wealthiest with the poorest, and to bridge the gap between the wealthiest of the poorest. That fund to become from the wealthiest, the funds money comes from the wealthiest, targeted to the poorest, managed by the wealthiest, doesn't go to the fiscal space of the government, but in coordination and collaboration with the government. But we need to link and bridge the gap between and solidify the societal responsibility and solidify the solidarity between various societal elements by bringing the wealthiest with the poorest. And this is another dimension. The paper thinking in the alternative dimension, the private sector contributions is not going to be that much to alleviate the issues of social issues and in terms of poverty and others. However, we found out is that a 2% contribution of wealth contribution by the top 10 wealthiest group in society can uplift and can resolve and support on uplifting the poor people in the society, in the middle income countries in our region that has a very highly debted society or a middle income. In addition to this, I think the other issue that we need to look is that when we're looking into the social policies and our social protection schemes, we need to also revisit the thinking of the social protection scheme, not only to become inclusive and comprehensive, but there has to be sustainability of these social protection schemes. We need to look into devising the social protection scheme to ensure they are sustainable, and we're looking forward to make sure that the size decreases. The idea is to uplift, and the functioning of these social protection schemes need to have a premise of upward mobility for the people. So you don't want them to be trapped into intergenerational poverty groups. We need these social protection schemes to be targeted for upward mobility among the targeted group. So the rethinking of the social protection schemes, which is a main piece of pillar of social policies, has to be dramatically rethought of in terms of inclusiveness, in terms of comprehensiveness, in terms of targeting, in terms of upward mobility lift, in terms of sustainability. You cannot address any social protection, and the idea which we hope in the future with the SDG as a goal, integrative perception into it, is that social policies, especially the social protection schemes, we would like them at the end of the day to become reduced in size, not increase in size. But while we're lifting and bringing people into upward mobility, that size needs to be trimmed, taking into effect of efficiency and effectiveness. Over.
Thank you, Rola, actually, and I want to thank you for posing the idea of social solidarity funds as a way to kind of bridge the gap between the haves and the have-nots. There's already a lot of philanthropic spending that is happening across the region, but not enough to streamline it and to leverage it. It's not well leveraged, I think. So I think it's a fantastic idea, but also the idea of expanding, looking at housing and other indicators is also key to thinking about more inclusive social policies and more inclusive economic growth. We will be coming back to the issue of the in the second round of questions of the sustainable goals. So hold that thought and we'll come back to it in a few minutes. I now move to His Excellency, the Minister of Labor from Azerbaijan, Sahil, if you would like to expand on the first question, which is the around the issue of COVID-19 and its impact on health, education, and social protection, and kind of the main challenges for your region. You need to unmute.
I muted, I guess. I hope you hear me.
Now we can, yes.
Thank you very much, and it's a great pleasure really today to talk on these topics with this distinguished people, and thanks a lot for creating this opportunity. Before going to Azerbaijan, I would like to raise two issues maybe, or to identify two directions where I think IMF and UN can play a vital role to somehow unify the methodology as well as the notions itself to better understand. The first notion would be a social expenditure. What is social expenditure? Because in the various regions, by various organizations, international organizations, and by various countries, this notion may include some, in addition to social protection costs, may include health costs, certain part of health costs, certain part of education costs. And it really becomes quite hard to compare when you don't have the unified methodology in your hand to understand better what is the general average, what are the goals where we have to move on, because especially in this region, some countries even include salary expenditures from the state budgets also toward the social expenditure course. So this notion should be clarified and unified for everyone to better understand. Maybe it can be direct social costs or general social costs, social expenditures, to better understand about what we are talking. Because at the end of the day, of course, health expenditures are also social expenditures. The education expenditures are also social expenditures. the certain various state benefits, state programs. For example, there is a very important housing program in Azerbaijan toward the martyrs' families and disabled people. These are considered at the investment cost in the budgets, but in the reality, these are given free of charge to the most vulnerable category peoples. So these are also social expenditure. Therefore, it's very important for us to better identify the direct social expenditures as well as the general social expenditures. And the second item that I would like also support both from the IMF and UN to also create a better methodology and unified notion about the poverty. What is the poverty? Because normally we calculate it based on the minimum living standards in the various countries, minimum living figures. But how to identify this minimum living figures? Some countries use the methodology of the consumption basket, include there certain foods, certain services, certain goods. Some countries use another methodology where they get the minimum basket of food multiplied by certain figures to identify the minimum living standards. Some countries moved more forward and they are now putting a certain percentage of the median or average living cost in the country as the minimum living cost. So this is also a notion which deviates a lot in the various countries and which very strongly affects the number of the people living under the poverty line. And here also, for example, in our opinion, moving toward the certain percent to a mechanism where, for example, 40 or 50% of the average salary should be stipulated at the minimum salary, or 40-50% of the median living cost identified at the minimum living cost, it is more important rather than exact figures, because it better shows how the welfare, the wealth of the country is distributed between the population. Because you can have a certain category of people living in a very high standard and the majority living under the lower standards, and then you do not reach the figure of the shared prosperity. So as much as your average salaries, average income of the population is growing, you have to constantly also increase the minimum living standard in order to have the shared prosperity in the country. So these two notions are very important for identifying the social policies across the country, because based on that, you as the government should stipulate various standards for the overall labor market and so on. Now, coming to the Azerbaijan, to our region, to my region, just for clarity, a short info about Azerbaijan, which is a very newly independent country, reinstated its independence just 30 years ago after collapse of the Soviet Empire. Very young country in full connection of East and West, of North and South. Some people evaluate us at the Eastern Europe, some people evaluate us at the Western Asia, and it's in the connection of all the major transit routes across the countries, and the culture and the economy and the overall social segment of the country is strongly affected by this diversity, where you have full diversity of everyone and everything. And an interesting figure, a fact for you, one of the rare countries where you can see in the diameter of 1 kilometer, you can see the Jewish synagogue, you can see Christian church, you can see Muslim mosques, also for all confessions, and a very, very big number of the various nations living in this little territory. Azerbaijan, as I mentioned, yeah.
Sorry, because we're going to need to move on to second round of questions. If you'd like to just
very short, yeah, very short. So our policy in overall country directed toward the social welfare of the people. And of course, during the COVID times, we took very strong social package toward the population. Our social package almost encompassed the 50% of the population. And here we gave very strong emphasis toward the keeping employment, both in the state and private sector. A very strong package was devoted to the unemployed people with the one-off payments, as well as supporting the private sector through the Sovereign Welfare Fund of Azerbaijan, as well as the relevant budgetary mechanisms, and almost half of the labor market fully benefited from the support packages, as well as the social support mechanisms were enhanced to cover the most vulnerable groups across the country. And I hope we are pretty much sure that we managed to keep the employment, which was a very crucial factor for us, and we do not have any big raise in the unemployment across the country, as well as we managed to keep the sustainability of the social protection system, which ensured full social payments across this 6 months period, even in advance.
Sahil, we'll be coming back to the impact of COVID-19 on Azerbaijan and the measures you did, but just allow me to move to the second round of questions, and you can elaborate more on this with this. Before I move actually to the second round, my colleagues at the IMF have asked me to remind you, for anybody who wants to send questions, you can send them on Twitter, on the IMF news channel, but also on Twitter and the YouTube channel, and they will make their way to me as the panelist. Antoinette, let me move now back to you with a second round of question, a kind of follow-up. If you could discuss with us a little bit what countries, I mean, what do you think countries need to do to ensure adequate and efficient spending on health, on education, and social protection, particularly in a context of high debt levels, rising deficits, competing priorities. I can't even say in a post-COVID world, because we're still in the COVID world, and the second wave is beginning to hit Europe and some parts of the Middle East and Central Asia. And we don't think we're going to be out of a COVID world. I mean, we won't be able to stay post for at least another year, probably. So what do countries do?
No, thank you, Maha, for that very important question, how to get it done, given all of the constraints. And as you say, of course, the region has been challenged by debt vulnerabilities way before the crisis in the emerging market and low-income countries in Central Asia and in the Middle East, significant debt vulnerabilities. We now look at debt levels closer to about 90% of GDP, so a very heavy debt burden. And in that context, how do they actually succeed at increasing social spending? Well, it has to work along maybe three dimensions that I would underscore. The first is to create a fiscal space, to work towards creating that fiscal space, and countries can do it differently depending on where they, of course, find themselves. For those countries that are significantly constrained with fiscal space, of course, and have very high debt levels, it makes a lot of sense to first look at reprioritizing the expenditure envelope that you have, and to make sure that what is being spent is the most high priority spending at this point in time, and that has the capacity to generate the biggest impact in terms of social outcomes and inclusive growth. And so that's one place to start by, for example, looking at some investments even that may be a lower priority and putting those off until that country is able to generate even more fiscal space. Another area to look at, of course, is on the revenue side. And I think in the region, quite a few countries have in the past done quite a bit to work on the revenues, mobilizing additional taxes. Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, for example, taken steps to to mobilize different taxes, diversify away from oil revenues. Morocco and Djibouti worked very hard to strengthen tax administration, rationalize exemptions, all with the view to increasing that revenue envelope that will then allow them to do a bit more without resort to excessive borrowing or borrowing that is not sustainable. The second, as you outlined earlier, of course, is the hugely important issue of improving efficiency in social spending. And the report looks quite a bit at that issue, underscoring the measures and the areas that need to be worked on for countries to really get more bang for the buck, as we say. And that has to do with high priority spending, first and foremost, of course, and increasing the efficiency with which those expenditures are implemented and executed. And that in turn has, implications for building stronger institutions, improving governance and corruption monitoring, project implementation more actively. All of that necessary to increase the efficiency of expenditure. I wanted to, in that context, comment on the point made, of course, by Rola on the importance of effectiveness. Hugely important. I couldn't agree more. It's not simply a matter of efficiency, but there is evidence to document that more efficient social spending does lead to effectiveness, increased effectiveness in the sense of better social outcomes. So they're related and they have to be taken forward together. Very important indeed. And I think the third area I would underscore, and this is not on the fiscal side, but the very important role that financial inclusion can play in helping to generate better social outcomes. And of course that the financial inclusion is very helpful in more spending efficiency, getting resources to who they're meant to be targeted at more efficiently with reduced corruption in the process of getting those resources to people as well. And allowing households better access to banking services that can allow them to mitigate the impact of a rainy day on their ability to eat better, to access health services. So, and all of that very important to improving social outcomes. So many valuable lessons we're getting already from this crisis, learning from how governments has responded to the pandemic, and all these governments being very challenged in moving very quickly to have an impact that protects people's lives. And so we're not done yet by any means, and there will be quite a few lessons to sink our teeth into going forward. Let me stop there.
Thank you, Antoinette. I'm going to actually pick up on what you've just said and turn to Rola to ask about, I mean, we've talked about in the report the high levels of spending in the region during COVID-19. Do we need to maintain these? And in the view of the debate between you and Antoinette on efficiency versus effectiveness, how can we do that? But also, I think in the broader view, and something that the report does outline, which is the need to strengthen institutions and improve governance of institutions that focus on the social, that basically manage social spending. So what are the venues that you see for this region in the coming, perhaps, period?
Thank you, Maha. I don't think we're having the debate, me and Antoinette, actually reaffirming our
I didn't mean debate, I meant discussion. I meant discussion.
It's reaffirming the points, which is very important to go. And I couldn't agree more on the importance of institutions and the good governance in the whole matter, and the curbing corruption and transparency. This is a key. And financial inclusion and digital utilization of digital technology is a key to curb first, it expands accessibility and it reduces corruption and cost for the beneficiary. I think the paper of the IMF highlighted it very importantly, and I think this is a key issue. There's no question about it into it. But I'll go back to the core issue, is the issue of the fiscal space. I mean, COVID-19 came and it mitigated and had impacted various sectors in the economy. It impacted the livelihood of the people, small businesses. It disrupted the whole system of the economy functioning. At the same time, it impacted also the growth of the economy, and let alone even the growth of inclusiveness. But it hit hardly the vulnerable ones. It hit very badly, hardly the vulnerable ones, SMEs, informal sector. And now we're talking about a region and that is tight with fiscal space. Liquidity is very key. Access to liquidity is very key. And now we're talking about having access to liquidity, but by not increasing the debt burden on these countries who are already highly debted. In our region, we have LDCs and we have a highly debted middle income countries. And we have 4 or 5 countries in the oil-rich countries, but even the oil-rich countries has a problem also on the fiscal space itself. But the majority of the region, a middle income country which is highly debted, cannot have more debt, and the options there, okay, they reallocated to mitigate COVID-19. But I'll give you an example. The whole region have announced around $100 billion of stimulus packages in different forms and format. And when you look into with its peer comparison, with its peers, we lack, okay, we spend around 0.4% of our GDP, while similar peer countries, developing countries globally, have allocated 1.1% of their GDP on mitigating COVID impact. We're lacking around $50–60 billion in addition to the $100 billion. Talking about liquidity now, where does it come from? Okay, taxes in an economy that is in a recession will not add and mitigate the impact. And here we're reaching out to the IMF and the global community into the DSSI and the catastrophe containment and relief trust that the IMF has. We're looking into extending it beyond 2020, end of 2020. I mean, COVID is not going to finish up, as Antoinette said. It's not going to finish up with 2020. It's going to go to 2021 and go to 2022 also, because the impact is not, it's dragging, even if you find a vaccine today, but to mitigate and get the economy back into engine. So we need this liquidity into it. But also the DSSI, it also needs to expand in reach out. It's not only needs to be targeted to LDCs. I mean, we have middle income countries that are highly debted. They cannot be penalized because they are middle income countries and they are highly debted. So the expansion of the SSI is extremely important onto that thing. And in addition, and I think concessional loans, we need to look into some concessional loans and the long term, but so that the idea is we're trying to think how we can get liquidity to the countries to mitigate the impact and steer the engine of recovery to recover better, so that we need to be targeted. But I'm saying even when we freeze our liquidity, also we need to ensure that it's targeted. It's not we're freezing up the liquidity for the fiscal space, but that fiscal space that we're freezing out, and the global community and the IMF works with countries, member countries in our region, needs also to be targeted. And targeted now, we're talking about the social spending into it. I do agree with Minister Sahil in terms of the definition of social spending. What does it include? And here we are at ESCWA embracing the SDG and the integrative notion of the SDG. That's why we expanded the definition of social spending to become more comprehensive. It includes education, it includes health and nutrition, it includes housing and community amenities, it includes employment generation and labor markets, it includes social protection and food security, it includes art, culture and sports, because it creates innovation, stuff like that. It includes environmental protection. So these elements, bringing the data and getting the budget of countries to target these social expenditure, to target on these dimensions is extremely important, in addition to the geographic locations. And this is maybe we at ASCO and the IMF can work together and take a pilot country in our region and start looking into the distribution. It's not only the central government statistics, but we'll go to the distribution, geographic distribution, and go within this. We are already working with Tunisia and Jordan. Actually, today we're talking with the ministers of Jordan. We're just having our panel discussing with them on a social expenditure monitor that goes and divides all of this so that we can see the efficiency and effectiveness when we start targeting into it. So we need to look into this whole thing in an integrative manner into it, and the reach out. The small businesses in our communities are being hit very hardly. And this is the informal sector, and the informal sector. The good thing about COVID, one of the good things, is that now it opened the eyes on the social protection. Now we're having information about the informal sector in certain countries where they have accessibility to informal sector to give them, like in Egypt and Morocco. So that we need to channel better policies to make sure that this informal sector becomes part of the social protection, but also start to formalize this informal sector. So there is different elements that we can do so that we rebuild and recover better.
Well, I'm going to come back with you with a question and to all the panelists, because we've now started getting quite a bit of questions from the floor. One of them is, how do we, one of them, somebody just sent in saying, great comment on the middle income and the penalization of middle income countries. But I'll come back to you with some questions on how do we ensure that our social protection mechanisms during the good days can serve and protect even better during bad days. But I'll come back to this. This is a bit more forward thinking. Sahil, let me turn to you with a final question before I bring in the questions from the audience. Azerbaijan has now been hit twice by the COVID-19 crisis through lower oil revenues and the need to spend more on health and social protection. So, and it seems like the sizable sovereign wealth fund, which is 90% of GDP, can help cushion the blow. But how do you determine the amount that should be spent on to support social needs of the current generation without penalizing future generations? So how do we safeguard the needs of the current generation without undermining future generations through the sovereign health funds? It's a question for you, but I think it applies to many countries also in the Middle East regions.
Actually, you pointed out maybe the major question in front of us, and we were hit even not twice, I would call it 3 times during the same year. First of all, COVID-19, which forced us to double, triple our health costs, built 10 more hospitals in order to meet the demand for the all infected people with this COVID. And till now we managed to keep it under control, and today daily rate is less than 100 approximately. With the cured people, slightly more than that, and in general the hospital capacity is enough for meeting this demand, as well as we had to boost social support and government support over the private sector, because the private sector was really stuck very, very, very seriously, and we are anticipating around 4% GDP decrease over the year end on this COVID-19 hit. Another big segment came from the oil prices. You correctly mentioned that oil prices dropped hugely, and in addition to that, as a part of the OPEC Plus deal, we had to cut the production itself. So the revenues of Azerbaijan decreased 2 times almost from the oil revenues during the year. And this is a challenge in front of us, how to use very wisely the existing resources in order not to too much enter and too much transfer the funds from the oil fund. Another major hit came in the last couple of days by the aggression of Armenia, neighboring Armenia towards Azerbaijan, which is occupying Azerbaijani territories. And today we have 1 million refugees and IDPs which needs strong support by the government for the housing program, for the social support, and for other benefits. And I have to mention that just during last 2 days, 10 civilians were killed and 30 civilians were injured by the occupation army of Armenia, which is the biggest handicap and the most serious problem for Azerbaijan, where the 4 UN resolutions adopted almost 30 years ago, not yet implemented. And Azerbaijan has to also, in addition to the fighting COVID-19, also has to fight in the real field in order to maintain its sovereignty. And how we can cope up with that? I think the major roads, major items were mentioned by the previous speakers also. The first thing is optimization of all costs. So budgetary optimization should go on and prioritization should happen. When you go on with the correct budgetary optimization, you always have a chance to save certain money for the social sector. That is our example, and we have passed already from this. In addition to that, you have to focus more spending on the active employment measures, because this generates the revenue. This generates the revenue for the people. This generates the revenue for the budget by a tax revenue, social insurance fee revenues, and so on. And as much as you spend on the active employment measures, the bigger benefit you get in the midterm and long term. And of course, better governance, digitalization, introducing single windows mechanisms. For example, during last 1.5 years, we introduced electronic pension appointment system. Today, almost 90% of all pension appointments in Azerbaijan are done proactively through electronic measures. This just in 1 year saved us around 100 million manats, which is 50 million euros just for the pension fund, and it's a huge saving for us. And we think that up to date, around 25 different types of the social payments have been passed to the electronic systems, the proactive system, and this clears up a lot of falsified payments and so on, which is another big source for the budgetary optimization. And of course, increasing the access to finance. That is an important segment, especially for the SMEs. Access to the finance is a vital. Here, I think that international donors like World Bank, ADB, IDB, and other key players should more focus on lending to the SMEs in these countries instead of going more to the infrastructure projects. So these are the key factors, in my opinion, which can help us for fighting the post-pandemic period as well as the second wave of the COVID-19 pandemic.
Thank you, Sahil. Actually, with that, that's a great segue to get back to Antoinette with a question from the audience as well. I mean, obviously, from what you're hearing, the demand on the IMF and on others is growing. And again, you may have huge resources, but still they are limited resources with so much increasing demand. The question from the audience now is social spending more important in a context like this than investing in total productivity and in infrastructure? That's one part of the question. And then somebody else asked, and I'm putting them together as a question, that in the past, the IMF had advocated decrease in social spending. Do you think that was a mistake at the time? And now, no, we have to focus more on social spending.
Oh, thank you very much, Maha, and thanks to those who pose those questions. I wanted to quickly, before I answer the question, speak to the issue of the definition of social spending, since that's been raised quite a bit. And some of what I've heard, of course, issues to reflect on, but we at the IMF, of course, are not experts in the social sectors. We certainly are advised, and we take good advice from those who are, those in the World Bank or the development banks more generally, who have done considerable work in in sort of linking expenditures to outcomes on social indicators, and broadly define social spending as health, education, and social protection spending. And that's what we've been using. But of course, points made about some expenditures that may be hugely relevant in individual country context. The challenge of those definitional issues is how you get enough data to actually make sense of that spending, and what really does it bring to the table. The danger, of course, of a very, very broad definition of social spending is that it can cover the whole budget. And in that context, how do you prioritize and how do you make sure limited resources are really getting to the most needy in the areas clearly documented by research to have the most impact on poverty reduction and inclusive growth? So that's the challenge of a broader definition, I think, that we need to really think about carefully. On these two questions, social spending, is not something that is divorced from increasing productivity. Better education, better skills, people able to sustain working because they have better health, those are huge ingredients to productivity. So there is no sense of privileging social expenditures at the detriment of productivity increase. You can certainly spend a lot on infrastructure that is not productive at all, and that is not increasing potential growth and productivity in that regard. So this is not an either or. Countries definitely need infrastructure. Some definitely in transport infrastructure, other infrastructure that are hugely important as well. But at this point in time, when inequality is a huge residual, will be a huge inheritance from this crisis, and knowing already the impact of inequality on growth that has been documented, it is hugely important that governments address that. And that will be with the support of social spending, but also, of course, leveraging growth overall. And so it's not an either or. It has to be a clearly articulated package that responds to specific country circumstances. It is not true that the IMF has, in fact, advocated cutting social spending in the past. In fact, if you look across all of our program work and the programs that we undertake with countries, all of the work we've done in terms of mobilizing to provide emergency financing, 90% of our programs have a floor on social spending that we actually look at very closely before we make a decision to disburse or not, and to complete a review or not. So those are very important things because we know, as I've said before, how hugely important social spending is to the core objectives that the IMF's mandate has us work on. And those are, sustained stable growth, and social spending is hugely important for that, and reduction in inequality, better inclusiveness, all of that. So there's no at all any discrepancy between what we've advised in the past and what we're advising today. Thank you.
Thank you, Antoinette. Thank you for a great answer. Let me turn to you, Rola. By the way, feel free if any of you want to come in on any of the questions. These are all from the audience, but I'm sort of picking them as I receive them. As I said, there was a question earlier from Kauthar Dara, which is she both commended the focus on middle-income countries that have been hit by COVID-19 and yet don't have access to similar kinds of financing as lower income countries. And this is something we've seen in the past in other crises. And I think for this region is particularly important as the scale of population movements, as conflicts expand further and further. But the question for you, Rola, is how do you support countries in investing in social protection systems in the good days? Now are not the good days, but in good days, so that that investment pays off when you're hit by crisis. Antoinette, as I said, feel free to come in on this question if you feel like it, but I'll turn to Rola now for that. Can I just add a question, Rola, to you in Arabic? I'll translate it quickly into English, since it's coming from the region. And it's saying, where is the equilibrium point between giving support, giving help to those who need it, and between encouraging, basically preventing people from becoming reliant on aid and encouraging them, the old thing, teach people how to fish rather than give them fish to eat. Especially since COVID is basically forced a lot of people to stay at home. So what kind of more global vision for, or a more cohesive or comprehensive vision, if you want, to approaching social protection without an overt support on the finances of the state, on fiscal, without overt fiscal pressure?
Thank you. I link the question and part of what Antoinette, and build on what Antoinette was talking about. You don't need to you don't need to convince countries the importance of social spending and social protection schemes for inclusiveness and inclusive growth. The issue is that and this is what the last question you have is, the issue is what I call is the sustainability. But the important thing is that, to me, you want to end up that your social protection schemes become extremely minimal to your budget if it was designed to become upward lifting mobility for the people, so that you don't keep, as the person who's asking, an intergenerational of poverty from one family to another generation, which are just dependent on social protection. So revisiting the social protection scheme is you want to uplift people from poverty and create opportunities. So social protection schemes, in designing them, needs to be inclusive, but needs to be creating opportunities for the vulnerable group and the targeted group, and to uplift them from mobility. If we don't design these social protection schemes in that fashion, yes, you will end up having these intergenerational people depending on social protection schemes. And that's what we're saying. We need to revisit this. We need to revisit it in a more comprehensive inclusiveness, but also to ensure that upward mobility, and important thing is creating opportunity. And this is where the issue is, we're coming up and bringing this, the solidarity fund that we're talking about, is because we're trying to say, let's have the government stand and become a facilitator and a coordinator, and bringing the wealthiest people to be part of this fund, the solidarity fund, that is targeted to the poor, to uplift the poor, but create opportunities for the poor and create the upward mobility for the poor. And the best people to do this is the ones who are creating their wealth. We're not talking about taxing these wealth people. We're talking about a fund that is managed by them, with the coordination and the facilitation of the government, but targeting to the poor, into it, to uplift them and creating opportunity. And creating opportunity is a key important. And this will create the societal solidarity, because once you uplift the people and giving them opportunity, it will be coming this societal solidarity between the rich and the poor, the wealthiest and the stakeholders. So we're bringing an additional dimension to the picture of let's talk about inclusive growth, but inclusiveness and reduction of inequality, bringing another dimension to not looking at only it's the state and the poor and the vulnerable people. No, there's other different stakeholders to come into it. And I come back into the issue of infrastructure and increasing productivity. Infrastructure is necessary, and but not sufficient to create the inclusive growth. So, but we need to have also investment in infrastructure. We cannot have investment in social spending and social protection scheme without having the infrastructure that people can use to bring a growth to it. So you can't have one or two. It is necessary, but not sufficient condition. And this is why we will go back into talking about the social protection schemes. But we are people who are advocating the sustainability in it, in terms of creating an opportunity so that we become upward lifting mobility, and not the old way, traditional way of thinking of cash transfers. Cash transfers never becoming a solution to it, the issue of bridging the inequality gap and making people inclusive in the growth. It never becomes the solution. It's an intermediate element. It's a catalyst, but it's not the solution. And our social protection schemes cannot be designed only on cash transfers. And I end up with an important issue is the issue of governance, issue of the institutions, issue of utilizing digital technologies are key elements also, and transparency are very key element of a success of any schemes that we're talking about and any binding of the things. And I think the paper of the IMF very clearly highlighted this issue, which is extremely important. Thank you.
Stay tuned. There's a follow-up to that paper on governance specifically, which I think we're all looking forward to. Thank you, Rola. Let me come back to you finally, Sahil. There's a very a question specifically on Azerbaijan for you. It says, as we know, unemployment rate in Azerbaijan is 5%. How will both COVID-19 impacted the unemployment rate, and are there extra resources? I mean, again, I think it's back to the question, what resources are available to address the challenges of COVID-19 today without harming the potential for future generations? Back to you, Sahil.
Thank you. It was 4.9% in the beginning of the year, the unemployment rate. Today, this rate is already 6.8%. So, and by the year end, we're anticipating unemployment rate around 7% in the country. But of course, the second second wave impact will be evaluated by us to have the better picture toward the year end. Still, it is not a big number, but also we know that there's a very big number of the informal employed people in Azerbaijan. So the biggest potential for us is to decrease the informal employment, to decrease the gray economy, and there we have a good success during last 3 years, last 2.5 years actually, and I hope that this dynamic will continue on. And during last 2.5 years, the number of the labor contracts, I mean the informal labor, increased 30%, 30%, which is a huge increase for the country because we have introduced various stimulus, we introduced new administrative measures, as well as certain tax cuts for the private sector in moving from the gray economy toward the formal economy. So these type of activities will continue. And we have managed, even during this very hard period of pandemic, to legalize around 100,000 person labor contracts across the country. And this will continue. But of course, the number of unemployed, truly unemployed people will increase. That is the issue what each country worldwide is trying to tackle. And herein we're trying to use as much as possible amounts for the active measures instead of passive measures. Rola mentioned that cash transfer would not solve the problem because you just teach people just sit at home and just receive payment from the government and do not do anything. Therefore, we introduced together with our partners from World Bank as well as from the UN, we have introduced a very big mechanism of self-employment program where through the state money as well as the World Bank money, we're financing the initial capital for the start of micro and mini businesses and small businesses. And during this year, we're anticipating to create 12,000 this type of business. This is the 5-year program. And during 5 years, we aim to reach 80,000 micro and small businesses across the country, which is a primary mechanism in fighting this the unemployment. So one major measure will be, of course, fighting informal employment and legalizing the gray economy. The other major source is increasing the self-employment programs across the country to enable small and medium level businesses to grow up across the country. Of course, all of them have got a financial implication, but we are very conservative in using the sovereign oil fund reserves in this segment. And in our policy for the coming 3 years is not to increase the transfer from the oil fund. So we'll be, instead of that, we'll be decreasing the transfer from the oil fund to keep these funds for the future generations.
Thank you. I think this brings us to the conclusion of this fantastic discussion on social protection, and I suspect one of many that will continue for some time to come. I don't know if Rola, Sahil, Antoinette would like to add any final comments before we close.
Yeah, no, thank you, Maha. I did want to come in to of course, agree with you on what a very good and important discussion we've had, and to comment on a couple of points made that I didn't have a chance to say something about earlier. And one of them, of course, is the fund's role in providing financing and debt service relief as we're doing under the CCRT. And under the CCRT, of course, focused on the poorest of our member countries, we are certainly well situated to advance to a second phase of that for another 6 months with the resources we've been able to mobilize. So certainly going beyond this October, which was the end date for that first phase, and working very hard to make sure we can continue the CCRT beyond that, to make it go fully through 2021, because we're hugely aware of the needed debt relief that our poorest member countries have. And of course, we are working along with our sister institution, the bank, on a report we'll be making to the G20 in the next couple of weeks, certainly in the context of our annual meetings on the DSSI. And we expect to be able to make a case there as well. But that is for the G20, of course, to decide on. And that brings me to the issue of middle income countries and why they're not benefiting from the DSSI. And I understand, of course, that some of them are also challenged with their debt vulnerabilities and debt burdens. And in that context, some have made the case for. But, you know, looking at the DSSI and the countries, the G20 countries, it's a very, as you know, it was a huge political decision for them to make. And when they compare some of themselves to middle income countries in the Middle East, they look like the same, frankly. And then the questions for them and their population who have to support them continuing this is, how does that country differ from ours, and why should we be giving more resources to them when they're just as rich as we are? So that's a question, I think, for those countries. Having said all of that, the fund is doing its part, of course, to make available financing it can to those countries. And we've done quite a bit of that already. We'll continue to do so when countries need it, no question about that. The MDBs also have to play their part. And their financing is certainly more concessional than countries would otherwise get. But the ultimate objective is to help those countries return to the markets in a sustainable fashion. And that has a lot to do with also all of the reforms that they can take forward and that we can help them to do. And the final point on sustainability of social protection schemes, no question about that. But these schemes do play a hugely important role when countries are faced by shocks that adversely affect, you know, people who perhaps had already had a job but lose a job. And so you need some safety net for them at those points in time. And certainly working to make those schemes sustainable, but to be available when countries need them to respond to an emergency as well. And social spending, of course, is much larger than social protection. It is health and education. And education and health, hugely important to build those skills that will help people live themselves. So those have to be prioritized. And let me end my comments there. Thank you.
Thank you, Antoinette. Actually, that's a great end to this session, at least. I want to thank all the panelists and the IMF team behind the scenes, and the people who prepared this report as well. And I guess this discussion will continue. But let me thank Rola and Sahil as well for joining us today.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, everyone. Thank Maha. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.